Holmes, we have been friends and cooperating for several years, and in that time I have not been able to understand how you solve your investigations. You see what I do not see. How do you do it?
Watson, you and I have in common that we are both researchers, you as a doctor and I as a detective. In every investigation, there must be a method.
Scientific method? Okay. A doctor can isolate a bacteria and discover that it is the cause of the patient's illness. But how does that apply to discovering the culprit of a crime?
Not only the culprit, but how did he do it? The first step of the Watson method is observation, defining the problem, using all the senses to discover what happened. That allows you to deduce with insight and generate an idea of how the events occurred. That is the second step. Generate a hypothesis. Finally, you have to test the hypothesis, test it with conclusive evidence. This, my friend, applies to all human activities. Even animals do it. They observe and look for where a fruit or a piece of meat has been hidden for them. Then they look for where they think their food is. If their hypothesis was correct, they get their reward. If not, they have to search again. We humans have the privilege of reasoning, and most people don't like that. It's easier for someone else to solve the riddle, which is why we have work to do.
Holmes, you say that your method can be applied to any mystery. Since we don't have a case at hand, let's investigate what a book says by applying your method. I'll take a book with my eyes closed. This one won't do. It's the Bible.
Why not, Watson? It will be interesting. Read it.
In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters.
Enough. Let us define the facts.
But Holmes, this is dogma. It is not a verifiable fact. The hypothesis cannot be ratified.
A researcher must find out, think, be perceptive and obtain evidence, sharpen eyes, ears, memory and ratify the deductions. We cannot put God under a microscope, but the researcher has to evaluate the facts that are presented to him, and in this case it is a testimony. Who and how he obtained it, we cannot know, because there were no witnesses. That means that it was communicated by someone, and the only one who was there was God. Therefore, we can infer that God told the story to some person who wrote what was narrated, probably Moses. Let's examine the argument. It states that God existed before matter and that it was God who created the material world. The world of matter is subject to the laws of physics. It has weight, it is affected by gravity, the chemistry of the elements, and above all, time. If there is no matter, there is no time, and things do not age or wear out. You can see what can be concluded with just 10 words. Let's continue. According to the testimony, God lives in a world without matter, which does not prevent him from being absolutely creative and developing his activities. Watson, this is impossible for humans to imagine because we know things through our senses. A specific sound is associated in our brain with an object, a bird, a motor, or the pronunciation of a word. In another language, the same concept is associated with another sound. House and casa are the same object, but for the English brain, casa is not comprehensible. But our brain has already identified the object with its function. For example, a pencil is an object to write on, a plate to eat on. But an aborigine who has neither pencils nor plates will see them as something unknown and useless. Similarly, Watson finds it impossible for us to imagine God's world unless he reveals it to us. I remember that Galileo Galilei was asked if he had seen God while looking at the sky through a telescope, and he replied, "He is not there." Watson, here we are faced with a great mystery of humanity. All the peoples of the world know that there is a creator of the environment in which we live, but no one has seen him. Jews, Muslims, and Christians know about him through his actions in the world and in our lives, and through what God himself has wanted to reveal. The Bible is a compilation of God's actions revealed to the entire world and compiled by the authors of the Hebrew people. Therefore, it is a book of facts and teachings given by God. Unlike the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are the fruit of Homer's imagination or ancient traditions of the Greeks, there are no inventions in the Bible, and that, my friend Watson, is feasible to study by the scientific method.
Do you know that the scriptures are interpretations? No one expects them to be corroborable. People believe them and that's it. They don't question them. I was surprised by knowing the scriptures.
Well, Watson, you are becoming observant. There is a big difference between a fact and an interpretation. In the case of the Bible, these are testimonial statements thousands of years apart. There are more than 1,500 years between Moses and Christ, 1,000 years between King David and the establishment of the territory of Canaan as the country of the Hebrews and Christ. In the year 587 BC, the Hebrew people were almost completely destroyed, and their temple and governing structure as it was constituted disappeared. The last books of the Old Testament were written between 300 and 200 years before Christ. And the most amazing thing is that the texts have not disappeared or been modified. Even more so since the printing press exists, it is the best-selling book in all of history. Why? There is another investigation. Watson, even if there were no material evidence of a crime, if there is testimony from an eyewitness who does not lie, that testimony may be the key to solving the case. Do not be surprised that I know the scriptures. No man who claims to be an intellectual can ignore the Bible. There is hardly any other ancient document that has passed more tests of authenticity than the scriptures, and no other with greater significance.
Holmes, what happens is that the Bible is a matter of faith, of dogma. People accept it without subjecting it to scientific verification. In fact, it cannot be.
Watson, science is not a touchstone. In scientific hypothesis, there is the possibility of human error and error when interpreting the evidence that give rise to the hypothesis. However, reality, the truth, is greater than science, even when we are not able to understand it. A fact is, and that is enough. Science tries to understand it, and in the future modify similar future facts, but an interpretation does not change reality, only the way the interpreter perceives it. Continue reading, Watson. The concert is until 7 in the evening.
I will summarize Holmes. Here he speaks of God separating the light from the darkness. Then he separated the waters, putting some above what he calls the expanse and others under the expanse, that is, the sea. This expanse is called heaven. When he separated the waters, he gathered those that were under the expanse in the seas, and dry land was exposed where God ordered the grass to emerge. Trees with fruit and seeds appear. Then he speaks of the creation of lights, the sun, the moon and the stars. Up to this point, 4 days have passed. On the 5th day, a curious man appears, saying that God ordered the sea to produce living beings and birds to fly over the earth, both of the same origin. And finally, on the 6th day, God orders the earth to produce beasts, serpents, animals according to their species and according to their gender. Finally, on this day, God creates man and emphasizes that he made him male and female in our image, God's, so that he may rule over the earth and the rest of the creatures. But he has a special characteristic, saying, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness." Intellectually, the argument follows a logical sequence, since there can be no life without sunlight, nor if the earth is covered by water, and logically the species of plants had to exist so that animals could eat and survive.
Well, Watson, the facts are stated. I am glad that, even if you are doing it blindly, you have chosen a book whose arguments can be analyzed. An imaginary text, like a novel, does not make sense to look for proofs. We have the facts. What is the hypothesis?
The sequence is logical, and it has been suggested that one stage spontaneously led to another. Cells differentiated some into plants, others into animals that became increasingly complex.
And the other hypothesis?
What other one?
The one proposed by the Bible, that it was God who created everything. Let's analyze both. For a hypothesis to be acceptable, it must pass all the tests, and there must be no evidence to rule it out.
Holmes, science does not talk about God. As you say, you cannot put God under a microscope. You cannot know him through the senses.
I heard a rather romantic phrase that says, "The blind man does not believe in the sun because he sees it, but because he feels it." Today, there are many enemies of the idea of God because God limits our capacity for action. God confronts us with our sins, censures us and punishes us for disobedience. This is what humanity does not accept today and has never accepted. On a scale, if we put God on one side and our greed on the other, which weighs more? Imagine, Watson, if God's law were obeyed, I would be out of work and yours would decrease a lot. Without theft, without homicides, without plunder, everyone would have the right to land, to education, and above all, to know God. Remember that we are doing an exercise in applying the scientific method. We are not talking about religion. Let's examine your hypothesis. You claim that everything happens spontaneously, by chance. Let's go back to the facts. God decides to create matter, which is mixed up, disordered, And among all that disorder, God wants a place called Earth. From all the planets, he chooses one at random. Is that right? Watson, it happens that right next to the Earth is the Moon. Did you know that, unlike the Earth, the Moon does not rotate on its own axis? And why does the Earth rotate? It turns out that if the Earth did not rotate, it would always face the Sun the same way. Then one half would be frozen, and the other half would be completely dry and burned, with no possibility of life on either side. On the other hand, the Earth's atmosphere allows oxygen and water to not escape from the Earth and protects us from ultraviolet rays and other harmful radiation from outer space. The Moon is right next door and has no atmosphere. Let's continue. Now that they have brought rocks from the Moon, they have been greatly disappointed. It does not have the minerals they expected. How many compounds appear in the table of elements? 118 chemical elements with different numbers of atoms and functions. Where did they come from? Because if they are not on the other planets around us, how did they get here? And don't tell me that one evolved into another because it lost an atom. If that were possible, they would have already transformed lead into gold. Each element is unique and unrepeatable. It cannot be manufactured, copied, or transformed, perhaps mixed, and not all of them. And why are they on Earth? The composition of the elements of the human body includes oxygen, 65%, carbon 18, 5%, hydrogen 9, 5%, nitrogen 3, 2%, phosphorus 1%, and small amounts of sulfur, sodium, chlorine, and magnesium. Each of these substances has a specific function. In our bones, our blood, they are required for growth, breathing, movement, thinking, etc. The Earth itself and plants cannot survive without minimum amounts of specific minerals. And the most curious thing is that in the Sun there is hydrogen 70 to 75%, helium 24 to 28%, and small amounts of oxygen, carbon, neon, iron, nitrogen, silicon, and magnesium. How is it that with the terrible temperature of the Sun, all the carbon and oxygen has not been burned? If the theory that carbon is the result of the decomposition of plants on Earth and that it went down to the depths of the Earth is valid, where does the carbon in the Sun come from?
I have heard a theory that they come from asteroids that hit the Earth and were buried by the force of the impact. That is why the gold is only in certain parts and scattered in the depths.
Throughout the Earth, the variety of minerals is wide, but the essential elements for life are everywhere. Your theory of asteroids does not satisfy me. Unquestionably, each element on Earth is here to preserve the variety and survival of all species. Another question. The axis of the Earth is not vertical. It has a very slight twist, and this twist makes it so that in the first months of the year, it is cold in the northern hemisphere and hot in the south. And what is more important, in spring, we sow, and in autumn we harvest, and the plants respond to that biological clock without making mistakes. Is that a coincidence? Without straying from the subject, what fruits does your family grow at home, Dr. Watson?
I don't know what the question is about, but I will tell you that there are apple trees, pear trees, peach trees. In the garden there are lettuces, tomatoes, spices. My mother tried to grow vines, but she didn't succeed. It's a large piece of land. There are hazelnut trees. Raspberries and blueberries are delicious, of course, flowers, hydrangeas, gladiolus, tulips and roses. What beautiful memories.
And where did such diverse species come from if the soil that feeds them provides all the same nutrients? The difference between one species and another is not in the soil, but in its heritage, its seeds, its exclusivity.
I seem to infer that Sherlock Holmes does not believe in the evolution that scientists and doctors claim today.
Watson, we must not confuse terms. During the Black Death pandemic in Europe from 1347 to 1353, a third of the continent's population died. It turns out that survivors and their descendants are stronger at resisting diseases than people who did not suffer the epidemic. That is natural selection, not evolution. If the theory supports that all living beings come from a primordial cell that was undergoing mutations that made it stronger and more apt to survive, and thus the different species of creation were differentiated, we have to ask, what is a mutation?
It is a change in the genetic code. All living beings have a map in each cell that shows the intracellular structures, what substances they must synthesize for the life and growth of each individual. This is called deoxyribonucleic acid. It is like a chain that is composed of an axis where basic units composed of a phosphate group, a deoxyribose sugar and a nitrogenous base that can be adenine, guanine, cytokine and purine are attached. The combination of these four allows millions of variations. It is something like a protein assembly plant that inside and outside the cell perform functions as messengers, hormones, tissue formers, repairers and formers of organelles of the cell itself. They are responsible for the defense of the cell and the individual as a whole. When a mutation occurs, it is called a transcription error, and the individual who suffered the mutation inherits this change to his offspring. It may be a beneficial mutation making that family more capable or stronger, or it may be an error incompatible with life and the individual is not able to live with this defect.
And how many proteins or enzymes does a man's body have?
There must be millions. I don't think anyone can know how many there are, because every day we discover more. Many diseases are caused by a deficiency or malfunction of one of those proteins.
I infer from your words that if just one of those enzymes or proteins is missing in a cell or is poorly made, there will be death of the individual or a structural defect. If, according to the theory of evolution, thousands of years pass between one mutation and another, how did the first cell survive if it did not have the substances that allowed it to breathe, or move, or grow, or reproduce? What I mean, Watson, is that if all the processes and mechanisms necessary for life are not present at the same time, a creature or a cell is not viable. It simply cannot exist. The simple fact of synthesizing the wall of a cell, one in isolation, requires such a quantity of chemical processes that they cannot be developed over time. They all have to be present at the same time. The same goes for cell nutrition, respiration, waste processes, and multiplication, just to name a few. Now, in living beings, you claim that not all mutations are to improve the species. There may be others that weaken or kill it. Why, if evolution is due to mutations, is there not a greater diversity of defective creatures or super-powerful phenomena? On the other hand, I have heard that apart from the similarity, someone supports that we are evolutionary descendants of the monkey because the orangutan has 48 chromosomes and we have 46. It turns out that the fly has 140, meaning that the chimpanzee and the orangutan descend from the fly. Cilantro and parsley are almost indistinguishable, but they are completely different. However, the most amazing characteristic of living beings is the male and female relationship.
Holmes, what does sex have to do with this?
Watson, if you cut a tender branch from an olive tree and under the conditions known to the farmer, plant it, another olive tree will grow exactly like the tree from which the branch was taken. Just as if you sow a grain of wheat, a plant will grow, but it may be different in many ways from the plant that gave the seed. The reason for this change is the genetic variation necessary for the survival of the species. Let's go back to mutations. If only beings with the same genetic code were to reproduce, a plague, virus, or bacteria that is capable of killing an individual would kill them all. You know, Watson, that for the multiplication of the species, a mixture of that deoxyribonucleic acid occurs, where each parent inherits to the offspring half of the genes that it possesses. Therefore, the child becomes a mixture of two creatures genetically identical in terms of survival capacity, but diverse in terms of other characteristics both in their genotype and in their phenotype, their appearance. Some develop as males and others as females. Some strong, others less strong, some black, others white. Some resemble a grandfather, others the other being children of the same parents. If there is no genetic variation, all the children would be identical, and a disease or a harmful mutation would be inherited in all the offspring, and the species would disappear. Let's not take it to man. Let's think about it in the simplest mammal, perhaps a mouse. That form of gene combination was already designed from the first mouse, and it is in all mammals. And what is more important, without females there can be no family. There can be no more males. The species cannot multiply, but this was like that from the beginning. The same applies to fish and birds.
Holmes, don't you think we're getting off topic? We were talking about your research method.
Precisely, Watson. We are analyzing two hypotheses. You suggest that everything around us is the result of multiple happy coincidences. At least, that is the theory of evolutionists and some archaeologists. But that theory needs more rational support. The other theory is that of the Bible. They call it the creationist theory. And the truth is that no scientist has been able to rule it out, even if they are not able to understand how it happened. The Earth and its surroundings have a purpose. Everything is rationally designed, calibrated to the nanometer. Nothing is left over. Even my ashes will return to the Earth to fertilize it. Nothing is wasted. And the most amazing thing is that everything is full of beauty. We are trying to understand the facts and explain how they happen. A scientist can explain that the colors of the sunset are produced by the diffusion of light at a certain angle. He can imagine how, but he does not know why. Don't you think that someone wanted it to be that way to help us rest our spirit at the end of the day? In any case, Watson, what draws my attention is that God created a unique earth among millions of celestial bodies and endowed it with so many unique characteristics to put life on it. Even more, he put in man a unique trait, eternity, that part that is not material. He breathed his breath into man, a gift that gives Homo sapiens, as archaeologists call it, unique and unrepeatable characteristics, inheritable and for better or worse. They confer eternity with God or without him, whether we believe it or not. Remember, an interpretation does not change the facts. I recommend that you start practicing with the details of daily circumstances. Questioning the what and the how will make you more observant and perceptive. But you must investigate, ask, read, because we cannot know everything, nor pretend that our ideas are the absolute truth. The hypothesis must be tested.